Good afternoon, everybody. I'm sorry for the delay. We had a little bit of an issue with the audio. We want to get started here and move through the presentation. We will have about 30 minutes or so of presentation, and then we'll follow that up with a Q&A session. And without further ado, appreciate your time this afternoon, and we'll get started. So back in 1936, Dale Carnegie wrote How to Win Friends and Influence People, and he brought together some very great points. What I've done is summarize a few of those, and we'll tie it into customer experience management here in just a few minutes. So item number one is really about listening to your audience and understanding truly understanding what your audience is saying, being an active listener. Lesson number two is really around assessing your audience's needs, knowing specifically what those needs and desires are, what are the root cause of those needs, and getting very familiar with them. Third is about prompting desire in your audience. So how do you actually entice somebody to want something that you are either selling or offering or wanting to change? And finally is communicating in terms of your audience themselves. So rather than being communicating in your terms or on a one-size-fits-all basis, trying to really, again, understand how your audience wants to hear and wants to consume that information. So I think some great lessons out of Dale Carnegie's writings, and we'll tie it into the rest of the presentation here shortly. So today we'll go through the several items. One is around what are the masses doing for customer experience management. Second is now what are the leaders doing for customer experience management and the differences in those. Third would be a four-step approach for building a leading customer experience strategy. Talk through a couple of case studies. Talk through how organizations can get started with customer experience management or enhance what they're doing already, since most organizations have that. And as I said, we'll have some Q&A at the end. So first I wanted to define what customer experience management is. And so in general terms, it's really about the entire customer life cycle, from onboarding through separation, and that includes the maintenance mode and loyalty mode. And as you can see, the onboarding includes things like customer acquisition, life cycle planning, education, all the things as you bring customers on. Maintenance is about product and service selection, marketing mix, how you create value from those customers. Loyalty is truly about satisfaction and retention, as well as around how you treat customers and communicate with those customers. And then separation, typically around win-back and unfortunately sometimes collections. So that is really the end-to-end life cycle from a customer experience management perspective, from pre-customer, prospect, to post-customer, and everything in between. So we talk about what most CSPs are doing today, and it really runs the gamut. We'll start with the simple and move to the complex. In sort of the typical scenario, we'll probably put 30–40% of communication service providers in the arena, simply because it's grown up that way, is a one-size-fits-all approach. Again, partially effective, but lacks some of the detail and touch from some of the other more advanced options. So it's a bit limited in scope. Next is heuristic segmentation. So heuristic, knowledge-based or experiential segmentation. So if you think about a typical marketing segmentation, it would be around looking at demographics, age, gender, and things of that nature to segment and understand customer bases. Third is campaign A/B testing. So again, as you can see, we're getting a little bit more advanced, looking at how campaign A is doing from a take rate perspective, for instance, versus campaign B, and looking at the differential between those. You can also think of those as champion-challenger models. Next is around survey analysis, and you'll see we'll start to get a little bit more in touch with the customer. And obviously, survey analysis is a great way to do that. Obviously, a bit limited in scope because you only get a certain percentage of customers to respond to that, but a very good way to outreach customers. Social media analysis, which is a lot of the buzz today. Again, great way to get an understanding of what your customers are thinking and doing. But again, there's a bit of self-selection in this arena because you have customers who, you're only looking at customers who are actually using the social media outlets, which is only a portion of those, that entire customer base. Next is statistical segmentation. So as compared to heuristic segmentation, statistical segmentation uses math to derive what the various attributes are of those segments. So maybe you're looking at more behavioral segmentation. If you're in the mobile space, you might look at number of minutes used, or how many, trend of international calls, or things of that nature, number of calls to care, that then actually starts to segment customers together. Treatment optimization, again, this is how you actually interact with your customers. You can think of this as offer, message, and channel at the customer level. And then finally, predictive modeling, and this runs a whole gamut of different techniques, from forecasting to operations research, and is some of the most sophisticated techniques out there in order to understand your customers. As you look at these, you can see as you move up the scale, you get broader impact, typically because you're touching more and more customers, as well as you're using more sophisticated techniques, hence the left side of the chart. Challenging today because most organizations are using a one-at-a-time evolution, meaning they might move from one-size-fits-all to heuristic segmentation to campaign A/B testing, maybe putting one or two of those together, but typically it's a slow-moving spectrum. Next issue is really around being performed in silos. So many organizations don't have a centralized analytics function or a series of centralized analytics functions to support different business units. You typically get your user at a desktop, going through and cranking through a survey analysis for a very specific, very discrete purpose, but not looking at that at an enterprise level. So maybe not bringing all the data sources, looking across the customer base, or doing a bit more of a holistic analysis. So some of the typical challenges, and what most organizations are doing today. So if we look at this compared against what the leaders in CEM are doing, customer experience management, you'll see a bit of a difference. First, the leaders are talking about the message and communication medium that'll be impactful, not as a whole, not at the one-size-fits-all level, but at each customer level. So how do I actually communicate with my customers? How do they want to read it? Is it a business reply card? Is it an outbound call? Is it a text or an email? And then what do I actually want to read in that email? Am I actually making an impact to get somebody to open that email and act upon it? Next, we're looking at how that outreach will impact the customer's immediate long-term loyalty. So if I do get somebody to sign up for service, do I believe that they'll enjoy that service and keep that service on, or is it a bit of a lost leader and they'll cancel that service after 30 or 60 days? So obviously trying to hone and look at the long-term view versus the short-term revenue view is very important here. And of course that impacts profitability. So you're looking at both short-term and long-term profitability. Happier customer stays longer, and hence long-term profitability is better, even if the short-term suffers slightly. Another area they're looking at is the understanding which candidates are likely to accept an offering or are ripe for that offering, and then of course who may be influencers for that offering. So if I'm trying to either stem churn or cross-sell something, I need to understand again who's interested in buying. So I'm not reaching out to everybody. I have a finite number of touch points that I can relay onto any individual customer before it becomes noise. And so I have to use those communications wisely. Secondarily, I want to use that influence spectrum, which you can use things like social network analysis to identify those influencers to then parlay that message out into the masses. Finally, they're looking at a strategy for optimal communication with the customer. So it's really bringing all of this together in terms of the offer, the message, the channel, the targeting, the profitability, et cetera, to truly impact that bottom line. So all these things really have one thing in common. They really focus on what Dale Carnegie said back in 1936 about listening to your audience, identifying those needs, understanding the desires, and communication in terms of the audience. So I'll walk you through the 4-step approach to actually building that leading customer experience management strategy. And we'll go into a little bit of depth here. So first is, again, we have to understand our audience. So when we start talking about understanding the customer, you have to understand who your customers are. And again, this goes typically beyond just demographic information and understanding, gender and age and things of that nature, where zip codes or geocodes where folks live. It goes into looking at the behavioral attributes of those customers, and then how those behavioral attributes bring customers together naturally. So I may have 2 iPhone users as an example, and those 2 iPhone users might be very, very different in terms of how they act. I might have one iPhone user that uses uses YouTube, a lot of over-the-top services, Skype, WhatsApp, and other sorts of applications on the phone. And I might have a secondary iPhone user who simply uses it for text and iMessage and as a phone. So even though you might put those 2 together because they're both iPhone users, they have the same version, the same OS, things of that nature, when you start looking at those groups statistically, they start breaking apart. And so you're looking at more utilization, behavioral trends. Obviously, the iPhone usage is one example. You can look at it as calls to care. You typically have folks that might call care for every minor technical issue, and you may have other folks who call care once a year. And again, those behavioral attributes start to really drive apart those segments in a statistical manner. The other thing it does is it starts eliciting some hidden behavioral trends, things that you hadn't seen. So maybe there are groups that are upticking in terms of new acquisitions who are starting to call care more and more, right? Or perhaps they're starting to make fewer international calls. So you're looking for those general trends that happened deep inside the data, and that really impacts your understanding of the customer, how you operate with those customers, again at a one-to-one level, and how you communicate with those customers. So I'll show you a quick example of a series of segments and subsegments from a customer behavior perspective. I won't walk you through all the details, but you can see here that there are, in this case, four master segments. Each of them have a series of subsegments, and you'll see in general these segments again are based upon behavioral trends. So usage, tenure, number of products, how many times they're calling care, the touch, how often they're adding or removing products, and what types of phones they tend to use, or how often they switch between phones. And for each of those, you can see percentage of universe, what their the revenue per month, or ARPU, average revenue per unit, or RPIC, depending on your sub-industry, your profit margins and churn percentages. So it just gives you an idea of what those customers look like. And again, if you start looking at those, you pick the simply usage customers, or the could be trouble use customers, the first and fourth subsegments, and they look very different, even though they're both part of that same master segment. So you can see, right, usage in this case sort of starts to differentiate them, as well as number of products that they're actually using. So that really gives us an idea of who our customers are. And next we're going to talk about the customer behavior at the customer level and what somebody is likely to do next. So all the business intelligence is fantastic, and it's a great tool, and it really focuses on what happened in the past and what's currently happening. When we start getting into predictive analytics, we talk about what's happening next. So what is somebody likely to do based upon historical behavior, trends, and correlations with other similar users. So in this case, you might look at somebody who's likely to churn. And as you can see from the chart, you might go from high likelihood of churn to low likelihood of churn, right down the path. If you're looking at a retention campaign, obviously you want to focus on the upper deciles. In this case, you can see deciles 10 and 9 are in that upper band. You can use the same for cross-sell and upsell. Who's likely to buy a very specific product or service? Who's likely to call care, consume, be an influencer, be profitable or unprofitable, upgrade phones, migrate numbers, things of that nature. So you can use this for a number of different areas, and we'll walk through some of those case studies in a few minutes. The other thing that this provides is really an assessment of why. So why is somebody likely to churn? What behaviors are they going to exhibit 30 or 60 or 90 days before they're likely to call in and cancel service? And most importantly, what are the causal factors? In many cases, we talk about the correlated factors, and the real difference, example of a difference is a correlated factor is something that happens to be just that correlated or associated with an event. So for instance, a contract expiring is a correlated factor to churn, but it's not a causal factor. Hopefully everybody can hear me okay. We just had one caller say that they were having a hard time. So if you're having a hard time, you can use the raise your hand function. I'll give everybody just a minute to look at that. Great. So it sounds like everything's okay, but our moderator will contact me if there are any issues with the volume here. Great. So, all right, so we'll go back into assessing why. Again, so apologize for any of the issues with the audio. Again, we're talking about what behaviors are going to exhibit before the event happens. So we want to stem, for instance, churn. We want to get ahead of the curve. If there's going to be a network outage, right, we can predict that we want to get ahead of the curve before the outage occurs. And again, the causal factors, the correlated factors are very important. The correlated factors, again, are really an opportunity. So an expiration of a contract is an opportunity for somebody to cancel. It's not a causal factor. They're not canceling because their contract expires. They're simply canceling because they have the opportunity at that point. A causal factor would be something like, I had a lot of dropped calls. My handset battery, dies frequently. I have poor signal. I have my pricing is, not amenable. It's too high. I don't have the right services, etc. So all those things are causal factors. And when you start addressing the causal factors, you get to the systemic issue, and you're able to then drive that. And that, of course, understanding the causal factors allows you to drive offers that meet the specific customer's needs. So we talk about, somebody who has a series of dropped calls, giving them $50 off their next bill isn't going to help fix the dropped calls. It might postpone them from canceling, but they will ultimately cancel. Giving them a new handset will likely solve that issue. And vice versa, giving somebody a new handset who has a billing issue, the new handset's a nice perk, but it's not going to fix their month-on-month billing issue. So that $50 off is a much better offer. So it's important to understand both aspects, who's likely to churn in this case, as well as why they're likely to churn. So very important in all of this is that there's no silver bullet, meaning there's no one attribute or thing that causes, and again, I'll stick with the churn theme here, but causes churn. So for instance, if we look at this chart, and I'll explain it in a moment, we look at the top piece, the trend in number of calls to care regarding billing issues over the last 6 months. That and that alone is important, but if we just looked at the universe, we might have 25% of the population that has an increasing number of calls to care regarding billing. So that doesn't really hone down where the trouble, again, the high likelihood of churn lies. What we have to do is we have to look at a combination of factors, something far greater than any human mind can comprehend. Typically looking at thousands and potentially tens of thousands of attributes simultaneously to come up with the 10 or 15, 30 or 50 attributes that sort of interact with one another to really identify and hone and target, again, with the example of churn, who's likely to churn over the next 90 days. So what I've given you here is just a quick common depiction of what a simple model looks like. We have 10 or 11 attributes here. You can see there's varying levels of importance. But again, even though there's one with the highest importance and one with the lowest importance, they work together. They cannot be taken independently to try to solve the problem. So hopefully all of that makes sense. We'll move on to the next, which is now that we understand who our customers are and what they're likely to do and why they're likely to do what they're going to do. Now we need to understand how much should we spend on them. So profitability comes into play. And as you can see, the repeating bands, in this case, again, a very simple example high, medium, low, and negative value customers. And what we're doing is looking at various levels, and we call it profitability or customer value. There's various types of customer value. We can look at pure profitability. We can look at revenue at a very simple level. We can look at customer lifetime value, which includes estimating how long they're going to maintain become or stay as a customer from today forward. And again, get an understanding of how much we should spend. If we have a customer, for instance, who's been a long customer, 5-year customer, and they're only generating $2 in profit a month, we're not going to offer them, a $200 iPhone upgrade because $2 in profit will take quite a long time to get repaid at that rate. Conversely, if we have a customer who's generating $100 a month in profit, we certainly want to treat them appropriately and give them the richer offer. So again, it goes down to how much we want to spend on the customer and how long that customer is likely to be a customer in the future. This is a simple example of the profitability. Again, this is a segmentation view. This is just one way to do it. In many cases, we would look at this either at a segment view or potentially at a customer level view and drive profitability at the customer level itself, which is obviously extremely powerful. Gave the simple view because it's easier to consume here. And again, you can see that there are 4 segments and a series of subsegments. And again, interesting, when we start looking at the segments, we'll see some differences. In this case, similar to the customer segmentation, we have high usage, limited products, tenured customers versus low usage, unused products, very tenured customers. So they break out a little bit differently than the customer segments because it's driven by profitability in this case. And you can see each of the bands really represents different bands of profitability. So the upper band in this case is anything greater than 10%. The yellow band being between 5 and 10%, just to give some context to where those customers lie. But again, understanding what's driving that profitability is very important. So if I look at the low usage, unused products, those are customers maybe who are going to have a higher churn rate because effectively they're paying for something that they're not using. So getting behind the scenes and understanding the derivative of that profitability is very important. So now we have a good understanding of who our customers are, what they're likely to do and why, and how much we should spend on them. The last piece of this puzzle is understanding how do we get the optimal response out of those customers. So what offer, message, channel are going to be most impactful in terms of driving that customer to a positive response. So again, you'll see bands here of various types of campaigns. Again, this is a simplistic example. We have 5 campaigns, and what we've done is that for each customer segment, for instance, or each customer, there is a specific campaign they're more likely to respond to. So when we start looking at the channel, maybe person A would like to receive a phone call, or person B really needs an email followed up by an SMS message. So those channels are important. The second piece of that is around the messaging itself. And the messaging gets down to very detailed information around, could be font size, what graphic you put on there, right, and other sorts of marketing-centric and artistic sort of flair to understanding how you get that appropriate response from the customer. And remember, the offer was driven by, right, the causal factors that we talked about earlier. So again, this is just a sample. I use the customer segmentation just for ease of use. Sorry, it's a bit of an eye chart, but the idea here is you're looking for the darker green boxes on the top. And what this shows us is if we have 10 campaigns, each of the segments and subsegments actually respond differently to different campaigns. And you can see there's a wide variety of response rates. So if I look at simply usage, it's obviously I want to use campaign D, which is an email for $20 off and a 1-year contract extension, versus if I move to the second to last row, the young and confused, I would want to use campaign C, right, which is 10% off and a 1-year contract extension via email. So right? Very small differences, but you can see the response rates in each of those are very, very different. So the purpose of this is really to hone in again to what campaigns you're sending out to which of those to elicit that response. They typically, the typical implementation of an experimental design is 100 sort of small cells or segments of the population, meaning we're testing 10 or so campaigns. And again, campaign could be variations on message and channel, as you can see here. And then, typically 10 rows as well. In this case, again, I used segment and subsegment as the example, but it can be broken out in various other ways. And again, taking that information in, understanding what those discrete response rates are, and now I have a great understanding of what offer I'm going to use for, at the individual customer level. So we want to pull it all together. We're going to talk about who are my customers, what are my customers likely to do next, and why. How much is my customer worth, and then how much should I expend based upon that worth? And again, worth can be today's worth or a futuristic look at worth. And then finally, how do I best communicate to impact behavior? So again, what message and channel do I use? And you can see lots of microsegments here, and there's lots of repeatability in these microsegments, which is part of the beauty of this approach. You're going to elicit the most detailed response, but in this simple example, there are only 5 campaigns or 10 campaigns you might leverage across all these subcells. But you're going to get fantastic response based upon this and drive home the impact that you're trying to achieve. So I talked a little bit earlier, promised you some sample use cases, and it really spans the gamut in terms of the areas you can apply this to. So again, just a few examples would be mobile media optimization, which can be, again, improving take rates, common theme here, optimizing the CPM, the cost per thousand, looking at mobile ad targeting. In the machine-to-machine space, or M2M space, as commonly known, we can talk about new sources of revenue. In the M2M space, of course, we're talking about typically low ARPU, high volume, nodes that are on a network. Supposedly 1 trillion of them by 2020, from one report. So how do I actually generate more revenue? How do I get to $2.50 instead of $2 per network node to drive up overall revenue? And then customer acquisition. How do I actually acquire those new customers? If you sort of roll back the clock and you think of when North America was not a completely saturated wireless market, everything was about customer acquisition. Well, in the M2M space, we're replaying that a bit now. So it's a great case study for for the next few years. And that'll span everything from smart parking meters to nodes in delivery trucks and things of that nature. Another example around network engineering, predictive maintenance, as I mentioned before, understanding when a network node is likely to go down, due to some faulty equipment or misconfiguration, overuse, whatever it may be. But again, predicting in advance before that network node goes down, so you can get repairs and adjustments made prior to a major catastrophe. Network-related customer satisfaction, and this is again an up-and-coming area where we're seeing network engineering really focused on how the network performance is impacting customer satisfaction. And then, of course, retention and ultimately cross-sell and upsell. Investment prioritization, and this has to do with where do I actually invest my next dollar. So when you look at some of the markets in the MSO space, cable space, if you will, investment obviously the investments are very, very large. So understanding where I'm going to get the highest penetration and the highest reward for that next dollar invested is extremely important. Customer profitability, also very, very important. And another example, we can talk about revenue inhibitors. So things that are actually stopping your customers from delivering you more revenue, as well as cost drivers. So understanding what those hidden areas of cost are. calls to care is always my favorite. Something that gets overlooked and sometimes averaged out with the masses. But calls to care, inbound calls to care, especially when you get to a live person, are very, very expensive. And understanding how long somebody's calling and how often somebody's calling, what time of day, what call center they're hitting, becomes very important. And so driving out those detailed cost drivers becomes crucial. So those are just a handful of sample use cases for customer experience management. So we'll run through a few case studies. These are actual case studies that happened over the last several years. First one is around customer retention. So I had a client who had actually one of the highest churn rates in the industry. It's a wireless provider, North American wireless provider, and obviously trying to become more competitive. They used effectively this approach and some semblance of this approach to understand their customers, understand who is likely to churn, why they were likely to churn, the customer value, and in this case, there was a two-stage approach for customer value. One was a short-term estimation of customer value and profitability. The second phase, which was a bit longer effort, was a true customer-level lifetime value that was derived, taking all the details into account. And then, of course, the treatment optimization, which again was also done in waves, starting with some A/B testing into some more advanced experimental design. And ultimately, what they were trying to achieve, of course, was a mass churn reduction, and they achieved that. So over a 3-year period, they reduced churn to the lowest rate in the industry by 40%, which is fairly significant numbers that you don't normally hear. Obviously, increasing customer loyalty, certainly increasing customer value because they were extending the lifetime of those customers. Also, which is not included in these numbers that you see below, those numbers didn't include the offset for having to add new customers, meaning one customer saved is one less customer I have to acquire. And typically, as a wireless example, it can be as much as a 10-to-1 ratio from retention to acquisition. So retention could be in the neighborhood of $50 to $75. Acquisition could be $50 to $750, sometimes upwards of $1,000, depending on the device and the subsidies that are provided. So just in terms of creating new value from those customers, meaning extending their life and generating that additional revenue from that extended life, generated $1 billion over the 3 years that were measured. So about $1 million a day, which was fairly impressive from the client's perspective. Second example is around revenue generation. We can talk a little bit about the one-size-fits-all approach, and that's effectively what they were using. So they had very low take rates on their offers, effectively trying to drive a small set of products in the same fashion effectively to a client. In this case, the client used a series of inbound calls, meaning the inbound calls to care as the medium, because obviously customers are calling in. It was an opportunity to chat with them directly, solve an issue, and then go for the cross-sell. And again, used a similar approach. So understood the customer segment, understood their profitability, understood what they were likely to buy, and then understood the actual message that went across. So the marketing department created a series of messages, and in real time, that message was then mapped against the other 3 areas: the profitability, the customer likelihood at the product level, and the customer segment. So very honed. And effectively, the first year generated about $100 million in new revenue. The client did. And then over the course of the next year, it ramped up to about $500 million in new revenue streams, and then maintained that level again for the 3 years that were measured. There were an uptick a bit in the fraud, and so that had to be stemmed from a call center perspective. Natural side effect, of course, but again, I had an increase in customer loyalty and had a marked improvement on the average revenue per unit in their case. Next examples around customer satisfaction, and again, looking sort of below the line and understanding how satisfaction is being driven by through the customer base. Looking again not just at the demographics, and customers that were churning, but using in this case survey analysis to understand what the customers were looking for and what they were missing in terms of the product and service quality. Looked at the top 10 drivers of 3 areas: satisfaction, overall satisfaction, the satisfaction for value, and then the content satisfaction. And uncovered a number of, I'll say, of golden nuggets in this case. Again, crossed the output of the survey analysis with the customer segmentation. Looked at the profitability of the customers. It was an open survey, meaning we knew who the customers were in that case. And then crossed that with basically call it the propensity or the actual satisfaction propensity to be satisfied, and also crossed that with actual churn rates so we could get an understanding. There was no outreach in this case, so that fourth tier was not applicable. But we really, the client shifted their focus areas from what they were doing previously in terms of driving satisfaction into a whole new arena. And finally, we'll talk a little bit about channel management. We were looking in this case at again, a wireless provider using direct and indirect channels to drive sales, and they were looking for 30-day forecasts for understanding churn and retention targets at the individual direct and indirect dealer level. And again, even though forecasting seems a bit out of bounds here, you're still looking at the same approach. So you're still understanding the customer segments, so you can actually forecast by customer segment. You're understanding the drivers, the propensities, from a forecasting perspective. Each forecast effectively would have drivers behind it for each of the various segments. And again, overlaying value on top of that was extremely important to understand, where those retention efforts should be focused. So the short story is, the previous accuracy was varying between 50 and 70% accuracy from a 30-day perspective, and the new approach drove about 98% accuracy, sort of at the low bar, up to 99+% accuracy. And it really helped them with their, achieve their operational goals. They were really trying to drive, obviously, retention efforts and hold indirect dealers and direct dealers liable for, for pushing the right products and ensuring customers were satisfied overall. So we'll spend a couple minutes talking about what your organization can do, and then we'll spend the last 10 minutes or so talking through questions, Q&A session. So again, just to recap, you need to listen to your audience, you need to understand your audience's needs, understand how to prompt that desire in your audience, and understand how to communicate with your audience. So as a starting point, of course, listening to Mr. Carnegie's of utmost importance here. In real terms, however, we'll talk about what organizations can do really in 2 phases. One is assessing, so what analytics, understanding what analytics are performed today, and that's a combination of descriptive and predictive analytics in all forms. Second is really about understanding if you have the right DNA within your organization to either create or use analytics, advanced analytics successfully. It's similar in terms of the descriptive analytics, but the outputs are slightly different. So sometimes there's a bit of a change in mindset in terms of how you approach customers from a marketing or a financial perspective. They're not big shifts at the end of the day, but they are definite mind shifts. Understanding how analytics is embedded in your organization. Is it a core competency, or do I simply have it in silos? Do I have statisticians and econometricians sort of posted at the desktop level, or do I have a centralized or several centralized groups across business units who are really focused on getting the value of analytics out into out for the greater good? Understanding the business challenges that you can impact, and again, this is it comes down to prioritization, and this comes in 2 waves. One is so strategically, how do you want to tackle that, and what value can you get out of that? But secondly, is it the right, is predictive analytics in this case the right approach, and can it be operationalized? And finally, it's around asking the right questions. So am I actually asking the right questions? Asking, for instance, whether folks who have iPhones in the Northeast are more likely to churn than not is one way to ask the question. Or I can ask about what the what are the behavioral profiles of customers who are likely to churn, which is a bit more of an open-ended question. The latter being much more applicable or addressable from an analytics perspective. So the second area is around taking action, and just some key hints around identifying the top strategic objectives, as I just mentioned, selecting the business challenges that align to the overall strategic initiatives, and that way you get internal support. Identifying the execution teams, and sometimes this is internal, sometimes it's external, sometimes typically a combination of the two. Defining success, and this is extremely important, ensuring that you have the right success metrics. In many cases, this is the validation and the measurement of success is left by the wayside. So we don't have that true measure. So looking at things like take rates for campaigns, reduction in churn, improvement in profitability or lifetime of customers, those are some of the key metrics that really need to be honed in on. And so you need to do a few things. One, you need to create an initial baseline. Two, you need to understand if you're going to keep a control group, so folks that you don't touch or don't impact. And then third, make sure that you're measuring appropriately across the gamut for those folks that you are touching. So you have an ongoing benchmark with that control group and ensuring that success continues to occur and be measured. And then finally, just execution. So making sure you're following through on each of those previous areas. But finally, we talk a little bit about the top myths. So very quickly, what we hear a lot in the marketplace is very difficult to get started. Again, probably misperception. Not that difficult, especially on an enterprise level. You still start on a small scale, and you still build on those incremental successes. So, contrary to popular belief, typically not very difficult to get started. And you'll see number 4, it takes a long time to derive value, which goes along with that. You can typically get to value within 3, 4, 5 months, which for any project that's fairly quick. We talk about getting the data together being overwhelming, and that again, misconception. Most folks think you need an enterprise data warehouse or something of that nature. In this case, all that magic can happen behind the scenes. In most cases, our clients don't have an enterprise data warehouse from what we've seen. And when I say enterprise data warehouse, they all have something called the enterprise data warehouse, but there are typically several of those. One that maybe covers usage information, others that cover the OSS, BSS systems, others for calls to care, and those things are typically not integrated. But gathering that data is typically not an overwhelming task, and something that we're typically working with clients on. We talked a little bit about success being difficult to define and measure. It's difficult because typically organizations aren't putting those definitions and measures up front, not holding out the control group, not creating that baseline. So as long as it's being put in perspective and the appropriate steps are being taken up front, the measurement process is fairly straightforward. Definition sometimes is slightly more difficult because you have various groups with different interests. And then finally, about processing being the process itself being resource intensive. Again, typically not resource intensive. Typically starting with small teams, of 4 or 5 folks in order to get the initiative started, and moving onward. Adding a few folks from an ongoing perspective. But it doesn't consume enormous amounts of resources. They are typically specialized resources, however. So now I'm going to do what I said at the beginning. I'm going to listen to my audience, and we'll open it up to the audience. If you wouldn't mind just typing your questions, and then we'll answer those questions in the order received. There should be a Q&A, if you can see my screen. There should be a question area here where you can type your questions. So we'll wait for the first to come through.
just raised her hand. I clicked on it to read it, and it disappeared.
Okay, we'll see if there are any questions. I don't think we have any thus far. Oh, I think we have our first one coming through. We have a couple of them here. Thanks. Appreciate the feedback. So the question is, of the various CSP segments, wireless, wireline, cable, which are more the most, and which are the least involved in predictive analytics today? So, sorry if I rephrase that. Which subsegment of the CSP community, wireless, wireline, and cable, are more and less involved in analytics? Hopefully, I got that correct, Jim. Typically, the wireless folks are the most advanced in terms of predictive analytics. Again, it occurs in pockets. Typically, the tier ones right have a very good handle. Again, sometimes housed in pockets. However, the wireline folks are typically because it's an older set of technology and a more mature market. Typically have a bit less of the predictive analytics embedded in it, but typically better on the descriptive analytics side. And cable MSO would be typically just behind wireless in terms of the capabilities of predictive analytics. So the second question is, what are the qualifications of the personnel required to monitor internal predictive analytics? And when we say monitor, I think there are a couple of areas of monitoring. One is the technical monitoring. The technical monitoring has to do with understanding how performant the models themselves are. So looking at what the lift of those discrete models are, what the response rates and things of that nature are. So that typically is a combination of a statistical resource, statistician or econometrician, depending on the area, and then the typically a statistical programmer to extract that information. In many cases, that information can be visualized in the dashboard. The second area is more common data analysis, which in terms of like response rates and ROI itself, can be typically embedded into either an internal dashboard or portal. So it's typically more of a business intelligence or descriptive function. So a little bit more common. And if I don't answer your question completely, feel free to send a follow-up. Third question is around, let's see, do you have an example for applying advanced analytics to B2B situations? Absolutely. So in the B2B space, especially in the SMB, the small and medium business or small and medium enterprise, depending on your terminology space, there's a huge play for predictive analytics. If I use a wireline example, for instance, right there's an enormous number of products out there. So you look at the migration, for instance, from DSL to newer technologies, IP technologies, in terms of connectivity. You want to look at how customers are churning, not necessarily from an entire account churn perspective, but from a revenue churn perspective. So are they dropping maybe previously more lucrative products to go to cheaper, less lucrative products within the portfolio of products? And in many cases, in order to stem churn, you actually want to proactively move them off of some of those older to some of the newer products. Again, talking about how to keep the customer available for or keep them on board for a longer period of time. So looking for maybe a slightly lower profit margin, but a longer lifetime. There are many other use cases, and feel free to reach out, Sarah, directly if you want any other examples. I have a cadre of them. So next is around looking at standards. So we have standards defined for segmentation you discussed, which is being followed by telecom industry, where everyone uses its own segmentation to assess customer behavior. Great question. So when we talk about predictive analytics, we're actually talking about letting the data drive what the segmentation is. And if I worked with a couple of wireless carriers that ultimately merged, the portfolio and the footprint of each of those organizations was very different. So the segmentation, the behavioral segmentation, ends up being very different. So you think about a segmentation for a company that's very strong in network, looks very different than a wireless organization that's very strong, say, in customer care, but has a weaker network. So you let the data really do the talking. The way in which you formulate the data, however, can be generally common across the industry if you're in sub-industry. So for postpaid wireless, you typically look at the same data categories and you formulate them in similar ways in order to apply the segmentation versus prepaid. Next question is what department owns the predictive analytics today, and are they the right ones? Another great question. There are a number of answers to that, unfortunately. So the short answer is it's typically owned outside of the IT organization. In some cases, it's owned by marketing. Some cases, it's owned by organizations like customer experience or customer loyalty department, which is a great place for it to live. In other cases, depending on what the analytics are specifically, it could be a shared services group that actually rolls up under the COO if you're doing like network forecasting and things of that nature. Sure, a brief description of a dashboard, certainly. So when you talk about the dashboard, you can look at interactive dashboards to help you understand, again, at a broad level, who are your customers, looking at those customer segments, number one. To the propensity to, again, just using the churn example, propensity to churn, reason for churn. Third would then be the profitability, and fourth would be the treatment. And you can fit all of those various pieces on a dashboard itself at a high level. So from a CMO or an SVP or VP of marketing perspective, you can get an understanding of what does my base look like today, what did it look like yesterday, and what will it look like tomorrow as a starting point. You can also then get an understanding of what do I need to do to address those. The dashboards can also typically drill down all the way down to the subscriber level, so that you can integrate those with your your marketing platforms such as Utica and others. Next question. Some companies have gone completely over to social media for customer care. Where does predictive analytics fit in terms of ensuring CSAT and loyalty? So social media analysis is very important. There are several views on them. One view, which I would generally support, is looking at social media as a great tool and a great approach. It's one tool, of course, in the overall, the overall tool set. Predictive analytics actually can use social media analysis. So if you think about social media, you're required to have a customer who's willing to post something on a social media site, right, in order to extract that information. You have, obviously, lots of folks who go silent, who I'm one of them. I don't typically post on blogs or tweet or things of that nature, just not my nature. Doesn't mean that I might not be dissatisfied with a product, however. So it's a great tool. It will get you very directly to understanding who's dissatisfied, but it's only going to get you to the portion of the population who actually uses those mediums, and assuming, of course, that you are monitoring those mediums. So again, great tool, just one tool in the entire tool set. Predictive analytics, again, part of the beauty, and social media I would actually include in the overall predictive analytics suite. Right, if you use it in the broadest terms, can cover the entire customer base. So you can actually use the social media analysis. You can use social network analysis and other sorts of inputs, text mining, voice to text, and sentiment analysis, and other areas to get a good understanding of what the entire customer base is likely to do. Let's see. Typical success rates for real-time data versus non-real-time data. So assuming you're looking at whether you have real-time or not real-time, it really depends on the application. Probably a better question to take offline. There are instances where real-time data is important. So, for instance, if you're talking about location-based services in terms of content and advertising, real-time is extraordinarily important. If you're talking about customer churn on a postpaid customer, it's actually less important. So if you get data every 15 minutes or hour or every day, or potentially even every month, you still have a very good understanding of who's likely to churn. And remember, in terms of something like churn, we're talking about predicting 90 days in advance. In terms of social media or location-based services, we're talking about the immediacy effect. So it just depends on the application. The next question, you say a statistician would be needed to do the predictive analysis. Are there no BI tools that can help do this now without the need of a statistician so the BI functional team can do this? So there are tools out there that that enable you. MicroStrategy, I believe Cognos, and Business Object all have, and even Excel has basic logistic regression and other techniques built in. The challenge is actually not in having the tool set. Tool set's important, but it's actually having the experience. So typical statisticians are PhDs in the area, and so they understand both the theory and the application of how to use the various techniques and what the pros and cons of each of those are. So yes, I'm personally not a statistician. I can go build a model. I've built a few, but I rely on the PhDs to really understand what the best approaches are, because there are dozens of them out there to address a very specific problem and understand how to test those and understand the pitfalls of each. Things like stochasticity, looking at things like overfitting and underfitting models, the benefit of things like neural nets versus linear logistic regression and stepwise. So understanding all those really the practicality of each of those behind the scenes is extraordinarily important. It doesn't mean that BI doesn't play a role. It plays a very important role. In fact, they end up feeding one another. What would you use to monitor social media analytics? Probably a long answer here. So there are a number of tools out there to monitor the social media sites, and we can connect offline to kind of go through those. I think the important piece is looking at what you do with that information. So if I'm looking at a blog, how do I actually extract the sentiment out of that blog? Where did they post it? What was the reach? Who are the typical users of that blog? So you can understand the overall impact of an individual post. So there are, again, many tools to extract the information, and a whole other set to actually get the utilization of the data. Last question, I think. Hopefully I didn't miss any. What about OTT? Can a carrier use predictive analytics to assess customers' use of third-party content and services? Absolutely. So OTT, for those who aren't familiar, is over the top. So when you think about the mobile space, in particular, you're thinking about things like Skype, Skype over Wi-Fi or 3G, WhatsApp, and other sorts of iMessage, other sorts of applications. So you can use OTT in a number of different ways to really assess the customer's use of the third party. You can actually, if you have DPI or deep packet information, you can actually get down to very, very granular levels, as deep as looking at if they're using Skype, for instance, are they using the voice only, the video and the voice, the messaging within Skype, and understanding how it's being used, where it's being used, what type of users are using it, again, from a behavioral perspective, when they're using it. And you can actually use that OTT data to understand impacts to network. I think the next realm of OTT from a wireless perspective and a network perspective will be really the arm wrestling, for lack of better terms, between the OTT app providers that are using the bandwidth and the network providers themselves, the CSPs, who are providing that bandwidth. And so I think some of that data, in the coming months or years, will be used to help with those negotiations to understand, how that can be further monetized on both sides. I think thank you very much, everybody, for your questions and your patience. I hope you found it useful. I'll just throw up, sorry, my phone number and my email address. You can copy it down. Feel free to reach out to me anytime, and happy to answer questions one-on-one. I think there are a couple of questions that I didn't answer fully, so feel free to just send me a note, and we can have a one-on-one conversation. Again, I appreciate your time.